These aren't the droids we're looking for.
Welcome back to Propology 101, and today we're going to continue talking about the E-11. Last week we talked about the hero version, or the blank firing. It's kind of hard to call it a hero because there were so many full E-11s, fully functional Sterlings used as E-11s. But there was a group that was not functional. Dumbly, they're referred to as the Bapties. They're not Bapties. Well, they are, but they're not. They were made by Bapty in-house. Per request of Star Wars production, they needed some deactivated, non-firing, non-gun E-11s to send to Tunisia for that shoot. Much like they did with the Hoth DL-44 for the Norway shoot, they sent Model Gun Corporation DL-44s instead of actual Mauser-based DL-44s. Same thing. These are pretty much kitted exactly the same, all the same pieces. So we're going to talk about those pieces, but very short, and we'll do that at the end. But let's talk about the differences and what makes a Sandy or a Sandtrooper E-11 different from the regular standard E-11 we see in A New Hope. Well, first off, Bapty cut the back ends off, and then they cut off the grips and the fire control group. Then they made aluminum sand castings of the back end of a Sterling. It's got the rear sight. Everything's filled in. It's very muted details and everything. They're slid inside the tube and then riveted together. Same thing down here. They're slid on and riveted together. Now, they also put a fake bolt in there. It's a shiny piece of metal. And they plugged up the barrel with a dowel rod simulating a barrel inside, but it also plugged up the barrel. So when everybody inspects these things, it's a non-gun. To identify these in the movie, to give you a couple quick spots where you can find these in Star Wars, besides the Sandtroopers, all the outside shots with the Sandtroopers, they all have the Sandtrooper or the sandcast back ends on them. Now on the Death Star, you'll be able to see and identify at least one or two when the stormtroopers come in and find our droids have locked themselves in the closet. That scene, you'll find them there. You'll also find when our heroes are in the trash compactor, they're using the sandcast E-11s. And that makes total sense because why jeopardize messing up a perfectly functional firearm when the scene doesn't call for it, when you can actually just have them dipping the sandcast E-11s in the water and having them in that nastier, dirtier environment. They're also seen a lot in production photos. I got a whole set of photos where our heroes are posing with an E-11, and it's actually one of the sandcast E-11s. And odds are that was allowed to stay with the Star Wars production when all the rest of the Sterlings went back to production. I don't believe Bapty got all of the sandcast Sterlings back. They probably did take them back in their inventory because they could use them as back down character weapons and stuff like that. So it still had value to them, but the Star Wars production probably also needed at least one for doing the production photos with our heroes. So how to tell them apart quickly and easily on scene. Now, if you remember in the opening scenes we talked about last week, because that's the best view we get of the Sterling in Star Wars, well, you'll notice that I believe all of the E-11s are all full-blown Sterlings in that scene, especially all the ones around Princess Leia. And I'll tell you how to identify them. The bolts are not shiny silver, and the trigger guards are the proper shape. And one of the easiest ways to tell, and you can tell two E-11s right off the bat in that scene, the blank firing complete E-11's scope rail starts at the rear vent tube and ends inside of the rear sight. On the sandcast versions or the Sandtrooper versions, it still starts in the front vent tube or the rear vent tube, but it ends before the rear sight. It bends down and then flattens out, and it's riveted to the aluminum sand casting. And as profile shots go, that is one of the easiest telltales of which E-11 you're looking at, whether it's a sandcast or a full-on Sterling. There's no evidence, and I have never seen any resin castings. And I don't know if Star Wars just left all the blaster work up to Bapty, and Bapty, because to me, in my head, if you wanted inert blasters to go to another country, you would just make them out of resin or fiberglass. They did it a lot in Empire Strikes Back, but in A New Hope, I think they just gave it all to Bapty, and Bapty said, yeah, we can make some inert ones, and they sandcast, which is really weird. Sounds like a lot of work to make sand castings to complete a gun you've chopped up, but that's what they did. Another thing about these is there hasn't been very many of these shown up. And the most photographed and documented one is the one that actually was found by Prop Store. When Bapty was folding and going under, Bapty had to close their doors because of British gun laws had gotten so strict that even for movie production, they could no longer have this warehouse full of live firearms in England. So Bapty was basically forced to close their doors, and when they did, they put the call out for people to come all over the world and see what they got. And basically, Prop Store went in and they came out with 20 Sterlings that they were able to link to the Star Wars production. They had found a majority of the cut down magazines. They found a lot of scopes and a lot of stuff that had been sitting in Bapty inventory for years. And they also found a Sandcast E-11. And that's the most well-documented one. Now, the one that Bapty is selling, it has an original M38 scope, but all these scopes are hard to match directly to a blaster. You can't do that. But since it came from Bapty, and the Sandcast came from Bapty, that probably gives you a good idea that scope, good chance that scope was used in A New Hope and or other Star Wars productions. All these things, when they went back to Bapty, they were torn and stripped back down. The Sterlings went one way and all the bits and bobs went a different way. But I can tell you that the counterbox is a replica counterbox. Now, I don't know if it's replica from that period or not replica, but reproduction or casting of. I don't know if it's from that period or modern, and I also know that the tubes are not original tubes. They're also replicas. Now, as far as the rest of the stuff go, we already talked about the M38 scope, which is the exact same scope that would have been used on the original and possibly is an original scope from the Star Wars production. We talked about the scope rail and the tubes and the counterbox, and that just leaves the wiper blades, T-rails up front. And the T-rails are also exactly the same on the Sandtrooper. There's one other funny story I'd read years ago, and I can't remember where I read it, but there were two young gentlemen at a military memorabilia and car show in England. And they came across an old guy sitting in a American World War II Jeep, and it was kitted out with British helmets and backpacks and all kinds of kit. And sitting in the front seat, or maybe in the floorboard, was a Sterling submachine gun. One of them was automatically drawn to it because he kind of recognized what it was. And he asked the old guy about it, and the guy says, it's just an old thing I got, and he didn't even remember where he had bought it from. But it turned out it was one of the Star Wars E-11 sandcasts. And we don't know if that had come from Bapty or if it was something that left the Star Wars production during or after everything wrapped up. But that was the first of the sandcasts to kind of get out into the wild. And that was probably close to 20 years ago. And that was the best documentation of one. But this thing had been passed around, swap meted. It was... It was pretty rough shape. It didn't have a trigger guard. It was missing a lot of pieces. I don't think it had a magazine. Obviously, it didn't have a scope or scope rail. It was just a Sterling shaped thing. The one that Prop Store put out on auction not long ago is the real deal. It's documented, it's tracked back, and it matches photographs and documentation showing everything, form factor, everything is correct from the original production. And all these sandcasts are 100% documented that they were made for the Star Wars production and not for any other productions. They were used in other productions afterwards, but they were originally definitely made for Star Wars. Thank you for joining along with this little discussion about the lesser known E-11 from Star Wars A New Hope. Join us next time when we jump into another Sterling, tear it down, or another E-11, tear it down and see what it's made of.